it is not my assessment that she has not succeeded in bending this institution to her will. It is the president's reading of the situation that it has not been sufficient. What is the message then, Carol, to other loyalists? And as you are doing your own reporting, do you have a sense of the pitch that folks who want this job moving forward are now making to the president?
So perfectly described. What's happening here is Donald Trump is sending a signal loud and clear over the horizon and into the ears of the people who are, gunning for this job. And that is, it's not sufficient to be loyal to me. It's not sufficient to let the White House dictate who gets prosecuted. It's not sufficient to, badger the heck out of members of Congress who are exercising oversight and deflect and avoid and filibuster so you don't answer their questions. Even though those are all things Donald Trump values, it's not sufficient. What will be sufficient is bringing sort of these scalps to, him at the Oval Office, the scalps of people that he wants to see pay those folks who are on his retribution list.
Laura, same question for you. Do you have a sense, as these folks are pitching themselves to the president, the types of promises that they are making?
We don't have just yet the details on specifically the way they're pitching themselves. But I think if you look at the list that we have, which sources have told us are on this short list for the president, all of them at some point questioned or denied the 2020 election, which we know has been a litmus test for this administration. They also are people who have been incredibly loyal. So the question is, which you posed, Alicia, is how successful can they honestly be in ways that Pam Bondi wasn't? Because, again, she brought cases. She attempted to prosecute the president's perceived enemies, but those failed. Jeanine Pirro herself also attempted to bring a case against those 6 Democratic lawmakers who issued that video telling soldiers that they didn't have to follow unlawful orders. And then she had to subsequently essentially drop that case. So she also has not been always the most successful. I think the question here is who is going to be Senate confirmable. They don't necessarily need Democratic votes to confirm one of these potential options. Jeanine Pirro did go through Senate confirmation, but that is something that I think they are going to have to make the case to the president, given the fact that not just with Pam Bondi, but also with DHS Secretary Kristi Noem, the 2 biggest exits from his administration here, from the cabinet level, it wasn't because they didn't go far enough. It wasn't because they weren't loyal enough or because they didn't attempt to do the president's bidding. Kristi Noem did carry out the harsh deportation policies that the president and those closest to him in the White House wanted. It was essentially because they couldn't go far enough. They couldn't execute it fast enough in the president's mind. And they also brought along some bad headlines along the way. And I think that it was the contribution of those bad headlines, be it about Epstein, but also not being able to fully carry out the president's bidding, and we hear the president just yesterday and repeatedly over the last few weeks, repeatedly referring to himself as potentially a king and saying that he wishes at times he were a king. And I think that that is what ultimately factors in here, is who is going to be able to carry out his bidding and to attempt to plow through the courts. And I think that whoever he ultimately nominates, and Carol can probably speak to this as well, too, will be met in a similar fashion to the way Pam Bondi was met.
Okay, we're going to come back to that, but I want to talk about those bad headlines that Laura referenced, Michael Feinberg. With the Epstein case, let's remember what it was that Pam Bondi said at the start of her tenure.
One of the things that you've alluded to, and this is something Donald Trump has talked about, the DOJ may be releasing the list of Jeffrey Epstein's clients. Will that really happen?
It's sitting on my desk right now to review. That's been a directive by President Trump. I'm reviewing that.
I mean, it goes without saying this is going to be one of the most indelible moments of her tenure, Michael Feinberg, and it's easy to look at retrospectively and say, from that moment, she effectively set herself up for failure.
I mean, look, I think she set herself up for failure from day one. because she took a job that, if American democracy holds, is going to be impossible for her to do. The fact that she was willing to, she really helped bring the Epstein controversy to the fore during the campaign in the early years of the presidency. And then the administration realized it had written checks that they couldn't cash, because one of the names that repeatedly appears is that of the president, Donald Trump. So, I mean, it's hard to muster sympathy for Pam Bondi for many reasons, but primarily because she dug her career's own grave here. She didn't have to amplify the Epstein files. She didn't have to say she was going to be able to prosecute and indict all the president's enemies. She could have played her cards a little closer to the vest. She could have been a little bit more strategic. In other words, she could have exhibited the qualities that lawyers are hired for in the first place. She chose instead to sacrifice her integrity for the sake of power, and now she has neither.
Carol, do you have a sense of what the reaction has been inside of DOJ?
You know, there's a large group of people who are still, as I describe in a couple of settings, holding on by their fingernails because they care deeply about the shared mission and values of the Department of Justice that they have long known and that Mike also worked under. And they are a little bit elated that Pam Bondi is gone, but full of apprehension about what this means for the next Attorney General. Because if Pam Bondi's version of bending a knee, bending the Department of Justice to the president's will, if her version isn't sufficient, how much worse will it get? You know, it is going to be, I love the way you phrase these questions, Alicia, because it is going to be nigh impossible to surpass the factual challenges that are necessary to indict and prosecute people without strong evidence, without evidence that's beyond a reasonable doubt. And it's hard to imagine how the next AG is going to jump that hurdle in a way that's different than Pam Bondi. But inside the department, there are people quite nervous about what the next Attorney General is going to have to be willing to do to meet Donald Trump's standard.
And Michael, given the almost symbiotic relationship between the FBI and the DOJ, what are you hearing from FBI officials?
My phone is blowing up with GIFs of children dancing in celebration and slightly more muted expressions of joy.
Indeed. Very quickly, before I let you go, Laura, your sense as the president and his inner circle put together this short list, how quickly we can expect this to move?
Well, right now, Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General, is in place, is acting for the interim. So it's hard to tell how quickly the president is going to move, but he has a number of people here who he has been close with for years and people who he is very fond of. He has created a soft landing for Bondi, similar to what he kind of did for Kristi Noem, because he also was fond of Bondi. But he is very close to Jeanine Pirro. He's very close to Alina Habba, his former personal attorney. These are people who are regularly either at the White House or Palm Beach. And so we know that they are definitely pitching him right now, as well as his aides close to him, for this potential position.
Alina Habba, truly the definition of if at first you don't succeed, dust yourself off and try again.